Hello there, and tonight I'll be reading you a sleep story you may well remember from somewhere in childhood. Marjorie Williams' The Velveteen Rabbit, first published in 1922. It's a quiet little tale of a small toy rabbit given to a boy one Christmas morning, and of what it means in the end to be loved. The kind of story that has lived on nursery shelves for 100 years now, passed gently from one generation to the next, and one that tends to settle the heart just so before sleep. Oh, and by the way, if you'd like an even better way to listen to our stories, you might want our app. It's called Tonight. You choose the voice that reads to you and what plays softly underneath. A little rain, a crackling fire, the ocean, on their own or all together. It's a free download, the link's just below this video. Before we get started, take a few moments to get cozy and comfortable. Allow your muscles to relax. Soften your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Once, in a tall, narrow house at the edge of an English village, there lived a small boy. The house had white painted shutters and a green door, and at the very top, under the eaves, there was a nursery with a low sloped ceiling and a window that looked out over a garden of pear trees and a lawn that ran down to a quiet lane. On Christmas morning, the boy came up the stairs in his slippers before it was quite light, and at the foot of his bed he found a stocking. It was a long woolen stocking that his grandmother had knitted years ago, and tonight it bulged in odd, promising shapes. There were oranges in the toe, and a small wooden whistle, and a string of glass beads, and a few sweets wrapped in twists of bright paper. And at the very top, sitting upright at the very top, was a Velveteen Rabbit. He was a splendid little rabbit. His fur was brown and white in soft, uneven patches, and his ears were lined with pink sateen, and his eyes were two round black beads sewn neatly to either side of his nose. He had whiskers made of brown thread that stood out very straight and proud, and his paws were stitched in a way that made them look almost as if they could move. He wasn't large. He could sit comfortably in the crook of an arm. The boy held him for a long time in silence. Outside, snow was falling past the nursery window in slow, careless flakes, and the room was lit only by the lamp on the landing, soft and yellow through the half-open door. Somewhere downstairs, a kettle was being lifted off the boil. For at least 2 hours that Christmas morning, the Velveteen Rabbit was the loveliest thing in the world. But Christmas, as anyone in a house full of presents knows, is a busy day. There were aunts to be greeted, and a clockwork train that came out of its box with a small printed booklet, and a model boat with real string rigging, and a tin of paints. By the middle of the morning, the Velveteen Rabbit had been set down on the rug, and by the afternoon he had been picked up by Nana and put carefully into the cupboard with the other toys, until the boy should think of him again. And there, for a long while, he stayed. The cupboard was tall and narrow, with 2 shelves of old toys and a third shelf of folded blankets. There was a rocking horse that had lost most of its mane. There was a wooden ark with 2 of each animal, the giraffes leaning slightly to one side because their painted necks were a little too tall for the lid. there was a tin soldier with a chip in his red paint, and a black dog on wheels, and a clockwork mouse that had not been wound for so long that no one in the house quite knew whether it still worked. There was a folded copy of a railway timetable that someone had tucked behind the ark for reasons no one now remembered. And, near the back of the second shelf, half leaning on a folded blanket, there was a very old skin horse. The skin horse had lived in the nursery longer than any of them. His coat had been brushed bare in patches where small hands had loved him. His mane had thinned. One ear had been mended with a stitch of darker brown thread, the kind a careful nurse keeps in a tin. He had glass eyes that no longer matched, because one had been replaced after a long-ago accident. And he was the wisest toy in the cupboard. He sat now in the dim light from the gap under the cupboard door and watched as the Velveteen Rabbit was placed on the shelf beside him. The rabbit was new. The other toys were not unkind, but they kept to themselves. The clockwork ones in particular were proud of being clockwork, and felt themselves to be a higher sort of toy. The wooden lion, who had been made in Germany, looked down on anyone who came stuffed with sawdust. And the Velveteen Rabbit was stuffed with sawdust, very softly and very fully, so that he sat upright on his small velvet haunches as if he meant to listen. He did listen. He had nothing else to do. He listened to the slow ticking of a clock on the landing, and to the muffled sound of footsteps far below in the kitchen, and to the small wooden creak the cupboard made when the house cooled down at night. And after a few days had passed, when no small hand had come to find him, he turned very carefully to the old skin horse beside him. He had a great many questions. "What is real?" he asked one evening when the nursery was very quiet and the lamp on the landing had been turned down low. The skin horse did not answer at once. He had been asked the question before by other toys in other years, and he liked to take his time over it. "Real isn't how you are made," he said at last. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, who always told the truth. "But when you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once?" said the rabbit, "or bit by bit?" "It takes a long time," said the skin horse. "That's why it doesn't often happen to toys that break easily, or have sharp edges, or have to be kept carefully. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand." The rabbit thought about this for a long while. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the lane below the nursery window lay quiet and white beneath a pale moon. A fox crossed the bottom of the garden without hurrying. An owl, very far off, called once and then was still. "I should like to be real," said the rabbit at last, very quietly. The skin horse did not answer. He had said what he had to say, but he leaned ever so slightly in the rabbit's direction, the way an old horse leans toward a younger one. And after a little while, the nursery clock chimed 11, and the rabbit settled down to wait. Nana came up to the nursery every evening at the same hour. Her step on the stair was slow and even, and she carried a small candle in a brass holder, and she wore an apron of pale grey cotton with 2 deep pockets. When the boy was already asleep, she would tidy the room, and the tidying was always done in the same order. First, she set the candle on the chest of drawers. Then she went to the window and drew the curtains. They were heavy curtains of dark blue cloth, and they made a soft hush as they crossed the rod. She tugged them at the bottom to make them meet. She left a hand's breadth open at the top, because the boy liked to see a strip of sky from his pillow. Then she gathered the things on the rug. There was a wooden engine, a scattering of glass marbles in a small leather bag, a book of paper boats half folded and half given up, and a printed church notice that had somehow found its way upstairs and slid under the chest of drawers. She put each thing back where it belonged. The engine into the box, the marbles into the bag into the drawer, the book onto the low shelf where the boy kept his picture books, the notice onto the small pile of household papers on the landing table. Then she went to the cupboard. She opened it very gently, because the door was inclined to creak, and she looked at the shelves for a moment as if taking a small inventory. The rocking horse stood where it always stood. The ark sat in its place. The soldiers waited in their tin. The skin horse leaned, as he always leaned, against a folded blanket. And the Velveteen Rabbit, who had been there now for a number of weeks. She picked up the rabbit. She brushed a little dust from his sateen ears with the side of her thumb. She set him further forward on the shelf, where the next person to look would see him at once. Then she closed the cupboard, gently. She turned to the bed. The boy was sleeping on his side, with one hand under his cheek. She drew the blanket up to his shoulder. She smoothed a strand of his hair away from his forehead. She didn't kiss him, because she didn't want to wake him, but she stood for a moment at the foot of the bed and watched him breathe. Then she took up the candle and went out, and closed the door behind her without a sound. She did this every night. The rabbit, in his place on the shelf, came in time to know the order of it. The hush of the curtains, the small clicks of toys put back into their boxes, the faint creak of the cupboard door, the pause at the bedside, the closing of the nursery door. After many such evenings, he could have told you, with his eyes closed, what part of the routine she was on. And he understood, in his own small velveteen way, that the house was held together by such evenings, that somewhere downstairs a kettle was being filled for the morning. On the landing, a lamp would be left burning low all night, and a child was sleeping under a blanket and would go on sleeping, because a careful pair of hands had drawn the curtains and brushed the dust from a small toy rabbit and turned the latch of the door very quietly. It was a good kind of being held. And then, one evening in early spring, the Velveteen Rabbit was lifted from the shelf again. It happened quite simply. The boy could not find a toy he wanted at bedtime, a china dog he had once been fond of, and Nana, hunting in the cupboard with the candle held up, took out the Velveteen Rabbit instead and put him into the boy's arms. "Here," she said, "here is your bunny." The boy was half asleep already. He took the rabbit without quite waking and tucked him under his chin and fell back into sleep as if there had been no break in it at all. The rabbit did not sleep. He lay against the warm cotton of the boy's nightshirt, and he listened to the slow, steady breath of a sleeping child. And he understood very clearly that something had begun. In the morning, the boy did not put him away. The rabbit was carried downstairs in the crook of an elbow. He sat on the rim of a porridge bowl. He went into the garden, where the daffodils were just opening along the south wall, and he was set on a low stone step in the sun while the boy dug for worms with a wooden spoon. That night, he slept on the boy's pillow, and the night after that, and the night after that. He went everywhere. He sat in the basket of the boy's small bicycle. Tucked into a pocket on the way to the village, he was brought out on a bench by the duck pond and dipped just once by accident into the edge of the water, so that one of his velveteen ears stayed slightly darker afterwards than the other. He was buried in sand at the edge of the gravel drive and dug up again with great care and brushed off with the flat of a small hand. His pink sateen ears began to lose some of their pinkness. The thread of his whiskers wore down. The sawdust inside him shifted a little, and his shape grew slightly less round and slightly more comfortable. He did not mind any of it. In the cupboard, the skin horse smiled to himself with a kind of stillness. The summer came on slowly that year. The lilac by the kitchen door bloomed and faded. The pear trees set fruit. The garden was long and warm and quiet, and the boy and the rabbit spent whole afternoons together at the bottom of it, in a place behind the raspberry canes where a patch of bracken grew thick. It was there, one afternoon, that the rabbit first saw the wild rabbits. The boy had gone in for his tea. The rabbit had been set down among the bracken to wait. He sat very still, he had no other way of sitting, and watched the soft green fronds move in a small breeze. 2 rabbits came out of the bracken. They were brown and grey, lean and quick, with long ears that stood up at every sound. They were not stitched. They were not stuffed. They moved when they wished to move, and they stopped when they wished to stop. And one of them, the smaller of the 2, came right up to him and looked into his black bead eye with a curiosity he had never been looked at with before. "You are a queer sort of rabbit," said the small wild rabbit after a long pause. "Why don't you get up and play with us?" The Velveteen Rabbit did not know what to say. He could not get up. He had been carried everywhere and set down everywhere, and that, until this moment, had seemed quite enough. "I don't want to," he said at last, because he couldn't bear to say the other thing. "I have just been sitting." The wild rabbits looked at each other. The smaller one twitched its nose. Then, in the way that wild rabbits do, they were suddenly somewhere else. 3 feet to the left, deeper in the bracken, without seeming to have crossed the ground in between. After a while, they went away. The Velveteen Rabbit sat on in the bracken and watched the long shadows move across the grass, and listened to a wood pigeon calling from a branch of one of the pear trees. He didn't feel sad exactly. He felt instead that he was more than he had thought, and also less than he had thought, and that both things were true at once. By and by the boy came back to fetch him, and the rabbit was carried up the garden and into the house, and laid on the kitchen table beside a saucer of milk, and the small bewilderment of the bracken patch began to settle in him. That night in bed, the boy held him very close. "You are a real rabbit," the boy said into his fur, in the small voice children use when they are telling secrets they already half believe. "You are. You're my real rabbit." and the Velveteen Rabbit, lying very still on the warm pillow, thought that perhaps the Skin Horse had been right after all. The summer slipped on into autumn, and the rabbit went with the boy through all of it. There was an afternoon at the edge of a wheat field, when the harvest was being brought in 2 farms over, and the rabbit sat propped against the boy's coat and watched the slow gold of the standing corn move in the breeze. There was a damp morning in October when the boy gathered hazelnuts in a paper bag, and the rabbit was tucked into the front pocket of a knitted jumper that smelled of wood smoke. There were long, slow Sundays when the rain came down and the nursery window streamed, and the boy and the rabbit lay together under a blanket on the rug and watched the small, bright fire in the grate. The boy talked to him. He talked a great deal, in fact. He told the rabbit about the village school, and about a hedgehog that had been seen in the lane, and about the cook's bad temper on Tuesdays, and about a dream he had had the week before that he could not quite remember in the morning. He told the rabbit secrets, in the way that children tell secrets, which is to say, not very secret at all, but offered honestly. The rabbit listened. His fur grew shabbier. The patch on his shoulder, where the boy's hand most often rested, was worn nearly smooth. One of his black bead eyes was a little loose in its thread. His pink sateen ears had faded to the color of old roses. But by the standards of the cupboard, by the standards of the Skin Horse, he was becoming, day by day, more himself. The winter came in quietly that year. The first snow fell at the end of November and did not stay. The second snow came at Christmas and stayed for almost a week. The boy and the rabbit watched it from the nursery window, while down in the lane a cart went by with its lamps already lit at 4 in the afternoon. It was somewhere in the middle of that winter that the boy fell ill. It came on quietly. One afternoon he was quieter than usual at his tea. The next morning his cheeks were hot. The doctor was sent for and came up the lane with his black bag on the front of his bicycle and went upstairs to the nursery without taking off his coat and stayed for a long time. After that, the days in the house grew slow and watchful. The curtains in the nursery were drawn during the day as well as at night. A kettle was kept simmering downstairs. Nana sat in the small armchair by the bed for long stretches, with her knitting in her lap, though she did not always knit. The boy slept a great deal. When he woke, he asked for water and for the rabbit, and Nana brought both and tucked them in beside him. The rabbit lay against the boy's pillow through all of it. He learned the small sounds of a sick room, the faint clink of a glass being set down on the saucer of a candle holder, the slow tick of the nursery clock, the soft tread of slippers on the landing, the murmur twice a day of the doctor's voice and Nana's voice, very low, in the doorway. He didn't understand the words. He understood the tone, careful and patient and unhurried. He understood, too, that he was needed. The boy held him a great deal. The boy's hand grew warmer over the days, and then, after a long week, slowly began to cool. The pillow smelled faintly of camphor and of clean cotton. The rabbit pressed against it and did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to be there, without moving, without complaint, for as long as he was wanted. By and by, the worst of the fever passed. The doctor came less often. Nana opened the curtains a little wider each morning. A jug of garden flowers was set on the windowsill. A sprig of winter jasmine and a stem of holly with 2 red berries. And the boy began to ask for things he had not asked for in some time. A picture book, a piece of toast, the clockwork train, and then, when he tired of that, the wooden ark. He still kept the rabbit close, but the rabbit, who had been with him through so many days now, had grown very shabby indeed. When the doctor said the boy was well enough to go to the seaside to gather strength, the house began to bustle in a slow, careful way. A trunk was brought down from the attic. Clothes were folded into it. A list was written and pinned to the kitchen door. And on the day before the boy was to go, Nana came into the nursery with a basket. It was an old wicker basket with 2 leather handles. She set it on the rug and began to gather into it the things that the doctor had said should not go with the boy to the seaside. Old things, soft things, things that had been on the bed during the long weeks of his illness. There was a flannel dressing gown, a small woolen blanket, a picture book with corners worn round, and the Velveteen Rabbit. She picked him up from the pillow. She held him for a moment in both her hands. Then she set him in the basket on top of the dressing gown, and carried the basket downstairs and out through the kitchen door into the garden. The garden had grown a little wild in the weeks of the boy's illness. The raspberry canes leaned. The lavender hedge had gone to seed. At the far end, near the bracken patch, there was a small heap of garden things, clippings and a broken wooden trug and a few old sacks, gathered up by the gardener and left to be dealt with later in the week. Nana set the basket down beside this heap. She would, she thought, come back for it in the morning, when she had more time, and decide then what to keep and what to give away. She had a great deal to do today. The trunk was not yet finished. The boy's hat box was somewhere it should not be. She straightened her apron, looked once at the basket, and went back up the path to the house. The Velveteen Rabbit lay in the basket on top of the flannel dressing gown and watched the sky. It was a soft grey sky. A few late roses on the wall stirred in a light breeze. A bee moved between 2 heads of lavender. From the open kitchen window, very far off, came the sound of crockery being put away. The rabbit lay quite still. He thought about the nursery, and about the long, warm afternoons in the bracken, and about the boy's hand on his fur in the dark. He thought about being real. He thought that perhaps, after all, being real was a thing that could be true for a little while, and then end, the way a summer ends. And then, because he was a rabbit, and because the long evening of his small life had grown very quiet, a small wet thing slid from one of his black bead eyes and ran down his velveteen cheek and fell, almost without weight, onto the petal of a lavender head beneath him. It was a real tear. He didn't know he could cry. He hadn't known there was anything inside him that could make such a thing. But there it was, on the lavender, very small and very bright in the grey afternoon light. The garden didn't change. The bee went on with its slow round. The crockery in the kitchen was put away. Far up the lane a cart went by. The tear lay on the lavender petal and shone. What happened next happened very slowly. The voice rests for now. The lavender head bent a little. Out of the place where the tear had fallen, a small flower opened that the gardener could not have named. It was not a lavender flower. It was a flower of a kind that does not grow in ordinary gardens. with petals the colour of the inside of a pink sateen ear, and a centre as small and bright as a bead. And from the flower, very gently, stepped the nursery magic fairy. She was no larger than the rabbit himself. She had wings the colour of pearl, and a dress the colour of cream, and a small face that was neither old nor young. She looked at the rabbit for a long moment without speaking. "Little rabbit," she said at last, in a voice as soft as the brush of a hand on velveteen. "Do you know who I am?" The rabbit did not. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that the children have loved. When they are old and worn out, and the children don't need them quite in the same way anymore, I come and take them with me, and they become real." "Wasn't I real before?" asked the rabbit. His voice was very small. "You were real to the boy," said the fairy, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." She bent down. She lifted the rabbit out of the basket very carefully, as if he were already a creature with bones and breath. She held him against her, and she carried him through the bracken patch and along a small path at the bottom of the garden that the rabbit had never noticed before, although it had been there all along. She set him down in a clearing, on a patch of moss between two thin birches. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said, and she kissed him once between his sateen ears. For a moment the rabbit did not understand. He had never run in his life. He sat on the moss exactly as he had sat in the cupboard and exactly as he had sat in the bracken. His velveteen legs were tucked under him. His paws were stitched closed. And then, very slowly, his nose twitched. It twitched, and then his ear lifted, the ear that had been dipped in the duck pond, and then the other ear. His whiskers, which had worn down almost to stubs, came out long and brown and fine. His fur was no longer in patches. It was the soft, even brown of a wild rabbit's coat with a white belly. His eyes, which had been black beads, were warm and dark, and saw the moss and the birches and the slow drift of a cloud above the trees. He stood up on his back legs. He had legs. He took one small, careful step. He took another. He could feel the moss beneath his paws, cool and slightly damp. He could smell the green of the bracken, the small, sharp green of something he had no name for, and somewhere, very faint, the wood smoke of a chimney across the field. He hopped, and the hop carried him an astonishing way. And out of the bracken, slow and unhurried, came two wild rabbits. The smaller one twitched its nose and looked at him without surprise, as if it had been expecting him. "Come along," said the wild rabbit. And the Velveteen Rabbit, who was no longer velveteen, went. The summer that followed slipped on slowly. The pears ripened. The lavender by the gate was cut back. The boy came home from the seaside with sun on his cheeks and a small collection of shells in a paper bag. And the nursery was opened up to him again, and the curtains drawn back, and the cupboard set in order. He asked once after his rabbit. Nana could not quite find the answer. The basket, she told him gently, had been taken away with the other old things. But she promised him a new toy, and the autumn brought a wooden hare on wheels that he came to love in a different way. The way one loves a second thing after a first. And the seasons went on as they do. In the spring, when the bracken at the bottom of the garden was just beginning to uncurl, the boy went out one morning to look for primroses. He was older now by a little, and quieter. He crouched at the edge of the bracken patch. A rabbit came out of the green. It sat for a moment on the moss, very still, with its long ears up, and looked at the boy with warm, dark eyes. Its fur was brown, with a small white patch on its belly. One of its ears was, perhaps, very slightly darker than the other. The boy didn't move. For a long moment, the two of them looked at each other across the small green space. "Why?" said the boy softly, almost to himself. "He looks just like my old bunny that was lost when I was ill." The rabbit didn't answer. Rabbits, on the whole, don't. It twitched its nose once. It tilted its head. And then, in the way that wild rabbits do, it was suddenly somewhere else, deeper in the bracken, without seeming to have crossed the ground in between. The boy stayed a little while in the green. The wood pigeon called from the pear tree. A bee, slow and low, moved between two early heads of lavender. Far off in the house, a kettle was being lifted off the boil. After a while, he went in for his breakfast. In the cupboard upstairs, the old skin horse sat as he had always sat, leaning a little against a folded blanket with his mended ear and his mismatched eyes. He didn't move. He didn't need to. In the nursery, the morning sun came through the window. The curtains stirred. The clock ticked on, slow and steady. And down at the bottom of the garden, in the soft green of the bracken, a small brown rabbit settled in the moss and folded his paws beneath him and closed his warm, dark eyes. The garden was very quiet. The bracken bent and lifted and bent again. A cloud drifted slowly across the sun, and the rabbit slept.